Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you send us and really get into what matters. Today, we're looking at a sermon, a really interesting one, that analyzes Matthew 7.1520. You know, the bit where Jesus warns about false prophets. And for you, listening in, especially if you're interested in quickly understanding faith, maybe particularly within Methodism and how it plays out, this should be really helpful.
Okay.
Let's unpack this. This sermon gives us a pretty solid way to think about spiritual guidance and, well, our own spiritual journey too.
Yeah. What's fascinating here is just how relevant that warning still feels today, discerning who to trust.
That's a constant.
And the sermon offers a very specific framework for thinking about it.
Absolutely. And it doesn't just look at those verses on their own. It puts them right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. It basically argues you can't understand the warning about false prophets unless you see it as part of Jesus's whole teaching on the narrow way.
That's such a crucial point. The sermon really underlines that this narrow way isn't, some vague feeling. It's defined by what Jesus teaches right before this, the Beatitudes, his words on anger, adultery, loving enemies, all of that. It's a whole picture of discipleship.
And when the sermon talks about prophets, we need to get the context right. It's not mainly about fortune telling here. A prophet, in this sense, is someone who speaks for God, someone who claims to show the path to heaven.
Exactly. So building on that, the sermon suggests a false prophet isn't always someone saying obviously wrong things. It could be more subtle, like teaching a path that sounds good but doesn't actually lead to real spiritual life, or maybe just failing to teach the true way properly. It's misdirection maybe, or just not giving the full picture.
Okay, so here's a point the sermon really drives home. It says, if someone's teaching a broad way, something popular, easy, attracts a big crowd, that itself is a warning sign. The authentic path, the narrow way, is presented as tougher, less popular by its very nature.
Right, and it connects that narrow way back to those specific teachings we mentioned from the Sermon on the Mount. Things like lowliness, mourning over sin, meekness, that deep desire for holiness, loving God and neighbor, actually doing good, and even being willing to suffer for following Christ. These aren't like optional extras according to the sermon. They are the path.
So if a teacher kind of downplays those things or offers a shortcut that doesn't loop back to these core ideas from Jesus, this sermon says, hold on, be careful. It doesn't really matter what words they use, faith, grace, whatever. If the result isn't aligned with this narrow way, that's a flag.
Mm-hmm. And it saves its strongest words for those who actively teach against this way, or who promote the opposite pride, maybe being flippant, chasing worldly things, not caring about others. That's where the sermon really lowers the boom.
Yeah, it gets pretty intense when talking about people who encourage that negative stuff in others, doesn't it? Calling them false prophets in the highest sense, even traitors and murderers of souls. Wow. It really shows how serious the sermon views this.
It absolutely does. It puts a massive weight of responsibility on anyone claiming to lead spiritually. And it highlights the potential damage if they lead people down the wrong path.
Now, one of the really sharp points in the sermon is about how these false prophets actually look. They don't advertise themselves as dangerous. The sermon uses that phrase, sheep's clothing.
Yes, and it unpacks that idea really well. It points out they might seem harmless, mild-mannered, not causing trouble. They might not seem radical at all, nothing to immediately set off alarms.
And they often frame themselves as useful, right? Like they feel called to help, to watch over people spiritually. They're the ones saying, I'm just trying to help you, guide you away from danger.
Right, and they'll often talk in religious terms, appealing to conscience, saying they're just zealous for God, doing what's right. They might even set themselves up as like defenders of the faith against some perceived error.
And maybe the trickiest part the sermon mentions, they often present it all as coming from love. Caring for their followers, warning them against going too far, maybe being too strict. They might push for a comfortable middle ground.
That really gets to the difficulty of discernment, doesn't it? Deception, according to this sermon, often wears a mask of reasonableness, even kindness.
So if appearances are tricky, how do we tell? The sermon's answer is blunt. Ye shall know them by their fruits. That's presented as the absolute key.
And it explains how to use that test two ways, really, and they're connected. First, look at the fruit of their teaching in their own life. Do they actually live out Christ-like character? Humility, love, patience, doing good. Is there real holiness there?
And it's not just about the leader themselves. The sermon says you also have to look at the fruit in the followers. Does the teaching actually lead people to become more like Christ, more devoted? Are lives actually changing for the better, spiritually speaking?
It's a demanding standard. The sermon basically argues a true teacher consistently produces good fruit, holiness in themselves and others, while a false one inevitably produces evil fruit, maybe lack of growth, maybe actual sin, worldliness. It uses that powerful image, the good tree bed, tree thing.
And the consequence for the tree not bearing good fruit? Pretty stark. Hewn down and cast into the fire. The sermon repeats, those who lead people towards humility, love, real righteousness, they're the true guides. But if the followers stay self-absorbed, worldly, or if their righteousness is just superficial, that's a bad sign, according to this sermon.
Which raises a tough question then. If they're so dangerous, should you just, plug your ears? Avoid listening to anyone who might be a false prophet.
Seems logical, maybe. But then the sermon throws in that curveball, referencing Jesus talking about the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23. He tells people to do what they teach because they have authority, but not to copy their actions. How does the sermon square that?
Well, the sermon's take is that this implies, sometimes, you might need to hear even flawed teachers. The reasoning seems to be if you cut yourself off completely, you might miss essential things like hearing scripture read, or maybe even the sacraments, even if the person administering them isn't perfect.
Okay. That's a key distinction it's making. The effectiveness isn't just about the leader's personal goodness, but about God working through these established means.
Exactly. So given that complexity, the sermon offers some practical advice. It basically says, in specific cases, you need to rely on prayer, seek guidance, and act based on your best spiritual understanding.
It also warns against jumping to conclusions, slapping the false prophet label on someone too quickly. And even if you do conclude someone fits that description, the sermon says, don't let it turn into anger or contempt towards them.
Ultimately, it comes back to personal discernment. The question you need to ask is listening to this person actually hurting my soul? If it is, the advice is clear back away, find healthier spiritual food.
And if you do listen, maybe because you have to or choose to cautiously, the sermon says, take heed how you hear. Pay close attention to the doctrine, be wary, listen with a bit of fear and trembling, knowing deception is possible.
And crucially, compare everything to Scripture, to the law and to the testimony, as it says. Anything that doesn't square with Scripture, especially any path to salvation different from what Jesus laid out, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount, reject it.
And the sermon pivots, doesn't it? It directly addresses those it considers false prophets. It asks these really piercing questions like, how long will you lie in God's name? How long will you twist his ways? It's very direct.
It really underscores the damage they're accused of doing, leading people away from God, hindering them from entering the kingdom. There's that woe pronounced on them. It challenges their own self-perception by asking, basically, where's the proof? Where's the good fruit in you or your followers?
And that stark warning about judgment comes back again. Every tree which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire.
And then finally, a plea to those being misled. It's an urgent call to open their eyes before it's too late, to put eternity ahead of, temporary comfort or worldly stuff.
Yeah, and it calls on anyone teaching without really being called by God to stop. It urges humility, prayer, seeking genuine faith that shows itself in good works. That's the evidence. And it ends with this promise of transformation and reward for those who genuinely turn others to righteousness.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, thinking about this in a Methodist light. Wesley's focus on personal and social holiness, it feels so connected to this sermon's idea of good fruit. It really makes me reflect on how we evaluate leaders and our own growth in that tradition. Absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture of, say, Methodist faith and practice, this sermon's stress on discernment fits right in with the Wesleyan quadrilateral scripture, tradition, reason, experience as tools for understanding God. The whole judge by the fruits thing resonates powerfully with the Methodist emphasis on practical divinity. The idea that real faith changes your life and makes you actively love God and neighbor. This sermon gives a strong theological underpinning for looking critically at leaders and teachings. It pushes Methodists and really all Christians to look past the surface, past just the words, and see the actual impact. It definitely brings up questions of accountability, doesn't it? And the constant need for careful discernment in our faith.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the main points seem clear. We need to be incredibly careful about spiritual guidance. Don't judge by looks or popularity, but by the teaching itself and the actual fruit, the holiness produced in the leader and the followers. The sermon shows how subtle deception can be, and it calls us to be vigilant, grounding ourselves in scripture and personal reflection.
Which leads to a really important question for you, the listener, to think about. How can you, in your own church or community, actively grow in that kind of discernment? How can you get better at spotting that good fruit in leaders and teachings? What practical steps can you take to ensure you're really on that narrow way that reflects Christ's core teachings, as understood perhaps in your Methodist context or your own tradition?
Yeah, definitely some things to chew on there. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you'll keep thinking about these ideas and how they might apply in your own situation. So, what does this all mean for you? Thanks again for exploring this with us.